There is no such thing as an African American genome. Not one. Not a single sequence of letters you could point to and say, this is what it means, written in the body. In 2010, a team of geneticists at Cornell University set out to measure it anyway. They took DNA from 365 African Americans and compared it, base by base, against reference populations from West Africa and from Europe. They wanted a number, a clean average, the share of a person's ancestry that traces back across the Atlantic. They got their average. But the average turned out to be the least interesting thing in the entire study. Because when they looked at the people one by one, not as a group but as individuals, the range they found was almost impossible to believe. One person's ancestry was nearly all West African, another's was almost none, and everything in between. This is a video about what a real genetics study actually found when it read the ancestry of African Americans, and about why the answer refuses to sit still. Why it is different for nearly every single person who takes the test. By the end, you'll understand something that the word race was never built to hold. If you stay to the finish, you'll see why the most honest answer to how African is African American ancestry is a question the study answered with a shrug and a spread, and why that spread tells the truest story of all. To understand why the numbers scatter the way they do, we first need to understand how ancestry is actually stored in a body, because most of us picture it completely wrong. And we need to start with the fact that dwarfs all the others. Every human being alive shares roughly 99.9% of their DNA with every other human being alive. Our species is young and closely knit. Everyone whose ancestry lies outside Africa descends from a small group that left the continent perhaps 60,000 years ago, and Africa itself holds more human genetic diversity than the entire rest of the world put together. So when we talk about ancestry percentages at all, we are talking about differences inside that final 0.1%, not different kinds of human. The same human, sorted only by which corner of one young species a lineage most recently passed through. Hold that scale. It is the frame that everything else in this video sits inside. Now, the second thing most people get wrong. Here is the picture most of us carry. You have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and somewhere back along those branches, ancestors from different places, and their contributions blend together smoothly, like paint stirred in a bucket, until you are some even mix of everyone who came before. That is not how it works. Your genome is not a smooth blend. It is a deck of cards, reshuffled every single generation. Every time a new person is made, the DNA from their 2 parents is cut and recombined into fresh chromosomes. Long stretches of genetic material handed down in chunks, not dissolved into an average. So you don't inherit a smooth fraction of each ancestor. You inherit a hand of cards, dealt from a deck that was shuffled the generation before, and shuffled again before that. Run the arithmetic and the shuffle gets vivid. On average, you carry about 1/4 of each grandparent's DNA, 1/8 of each great-grandparent's, 1/16 of the generation before that. But average is not guarantee. Because the deck is dealt in chunks, the real number swings hard. Go back 6 or 7 generations, to the era this study is really about, and any one ancestor's expected contribution is only 1% or 2. Which means, purely by the luck of the shuffle, some of your ancestors from that far back have left no detectable trace in you at all, while others loom far larger than their share. Which also means 2 siblings, same mother, same father, can carry noticeably different amounts of ancestry from the same great-great-grandparent. One of them drew the card, the other didn't. Hold on to that image, the shuffled deck, the dealt hand, because it is the single key to everything the Cornell study found. When you understand that ancestry is dealt and not blended, the strange spread of numbers stops being strange. It becomes the only thing that could have happened. So let's go back to the study itself. The paper was published in 2010 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, led by the geneticist Bryc. And the method matters, because it's more careful than the way ancestry usually gets talked about. They didn't just ask whether someone's DNA looked African or European overall. They walked along each chromosome, segment by segment, and asked of each stretch, where did this piece most likely come from? A person's genome became a long ribbon painted in bands. This length West African, this length European, this shorter length from somewhere else. Ancestry deconvolution, they call it, reading the deck one card at a time. And only after painting every ribbon did they add it all up. But there's a problem buried inside that word, West African, and Bryc's team had to solve it before they could measure anything at all. Because to say a segment of DNA is West African, you first need to know what West African DNA actually looks like. And West Africa is not one people. It is hundreds. So the study sampled a range of West African populations, groups like the Yoruba and the Mandinka among them, and found real genetic structure between them, distinct populations, distinguishable one from another by their DNA. And that matters here more than almost anything. Because the transatlantic slave trade did not draw from a single village or a single nation. It pulled from an entire coast and deep into the interior, across many peoples, many languages, many kingdoms. So the West African ancestry inside an African American genome is not one thing either. It traces back to many peoples, Yoruba, Igbo, Akan, Mandinka, and more, blended together by the same machinery that carried them across the ocean. Even the African three-quarters is not a single origin. It is a continent's worth of distinct peoples, collapsed by history into one word on a form. Now, the average. Across all 365 people, the West African share came out at roughly 78%. About a fifth, near 19%, traced to Europe, and a small, uneven sliver traced elsewhere. If the story stopped there, it would be a tidy headline. African Americans are, on average, a little over 3/4 West African. True enough, and almost meaningless, because nobody is the average. Here is the finding that should stop you. When Bryc's team looked at individual people rather than the group, the amount of West African ancestry did not cluster tightly around that 78%. It spread across almost the entire range it is possible to spread. Some individuals in the study were nearly all West African in ancestry. Others carried only a small fraction. The West African share ran, person to person, from near the very bottom of the scale to near the very top. From almost none to almost all. Think about what that means for a moment. Two people can both be African American, same community, same history, same word used to describe them on a form. And one of them can carry more than 90% West African ancestry, while the other carries a minority of it. The label is identical. The genome underneath is not just different in degree, it is different in kind. This is why there is no African American genome to point to. Not because the ancestry isn't real, it is deeply, measurably real, but because a single number was never going to hold 365 different hands of cards. The average is a shadow cast by hundreds of individual people, and no one is standing exactly where the shadow falls. To put that spread in perspective, imagine lining all 365 people up by their West African percentage, lowest to highest. You would not get a tight little cluster around 78. You would get a ramp that climbs almost the full height of the scale, one person at a time, with no natural break anywhere along it. No place to point and say, here is where one kind of person ends and another begins. There is no line. There is only the ramp. And the average is just the step in the middle that happens to have people standing on both sides of it. And then the study found something in the pattern of that ancestry that carries the weight of history in it. The genome doesn't only tell you how much ancestry came from where. It can tell you, in part, how it arrived. Through which parent, down which line. Because different pieces of DNA are inherited in different ways. The Y chromosome passes only from father to son, down the direct male line. Mitochondrial DNA passes only from mother to child, down the direct female line. And the X chromosome spends more of its history in women than in men. Each of these carries its own separate record of who your direct ancestors were on those specific paths. And when Bryc's team read those records, they did not match. The European ancestry in the sample entered overwhelmingly through the male line. The African ancestry, overwhelmingly through the female line. This is what geneticists call sex-biased admixture, and behind that flat clinical phrase is one of the plainest, hardest facts in American history. For generations, under slavery, the people whose union produced these lineages were most often enslaved African women and the European men who held power over them. The imbalance was not a choice recorded in the genome, it was force, recorded in the genome. The DNA remembers what the records often tried not to. Not as an accusation, and not as a headline, just as a true thing, carried quietly in the chromosomes of millions of living people, that the paperwork of the time was never honest enough to write down. And just as the African ancestry is many peoples, the European ancestry is too, British, Irish, Iberian, and more, depending on who happened to be where. Pair that with the segment clock we'll come back to, and something quietly striking surfaces. Much of that European ancestry entered during one specific window, the generations of slavery itself, and the length of the bands still carries the timing. Not a vague, ancient blending lost to deep time. A datable event, close enough to touch, written into the DNA of people alive today. To understand why the ancestry lands where it does at all, you have to understand the scale of what produced it. Over roughly 3.5 centuries, the transatlantic slave trade forcibly carried more than 12 million people from Africa to the Americas. The great majority were taken to the Caribbean and to South America. A smaller share, several hundred thousand, were brought to what became the United States, where a growing enslaved population meant most later generations were born into slavery on this soil. The ancestry Bryc's team measured is the genetic aftermath of that specific event. Which regions people were taken from, in what numbers, and what happened to families across the generations that followed. The genome is not making an argument about any of it. It is simply the ledger it left behind, the one record no one set out to keep and no one could erase. The geography told a story too. Ancestry in a population is never spread evenly across a map, because history never was. The trade, the plantations, the migrations, the places people were taken to, and the places they later moved, all of it leaves an uneven fingerprint. Later work by the same researcher, Katarzyna Bryc, in a much larger study in 2015, mapped exactly this. African American ancestry proportions shifting measurably from one region of the United States to another. The share of European ancestry, the share of West African ancestry, they were not the same in every state. The genome was drawing a map of where people had been held, where they had settled, where they had moved in the generations after freedom. Which means the numbers in a single person's DNA are not just about them. They are a small, personal copy of a national history, the routes and the ruptures of it, folded into a body and handed down. There's a piece of family lore this study, and the ones after it, kept running into. Almost everyone has heard it. A grandmother, a great-grandmother, Native American, the story goes. It appears in family histories across Black America again and again. And the DNA tells a gentler, more complicated truth. The Native American ancestry that shows up in African American genomes is real, but it is, on average, small. Much smaller than the family stories usually suggest. In many people, it is a faint trace. In some, it isn't there at all. The proud grandmother is often, in the genetic record, a much more distant ancestor whose contribution has been shuffled down to a sliver, or a story that stood in for something else entirely. This isn't a debunking, and it shouldn't feel like one. Family memory carries truths that DNA can't. Names, love, survival, the reasons a story got told at all. But it's worth seeing clearly. The deck reshuffles hard over 6 or 7 generations. A whole ancestor can shrink to a single card. Sometimes the card gets dealt. Often it doesn't. The story outlives the segment. So what does all of this mean for the thing most people actually encounter? The ancestry test, the pie chart, the little percentages in an app. If you've ever taken one of those tests, or watched someone open their results, and seen a small, unexplained slice, a few percent from somewhere nobody expected, this study is part of the reason why. The test is doing exactly what Bryc team did, just automated and scaled up. It walks your chromosomes, paints the segments, and adds them up. And because your genome is a dealt hand and not a blend, it will almost always contain a few short segments that trace to places your family never mentioned. Carried down, shuffled small, still legible in the cards. The surprising 2% isn't an error, it's an ancestor. Usually a distant one, reduced by generations of reshuffling to a single faint band on a single chromosome. But a real person, who really lived, whose thread never fully left the weave. That is the strange intimacy of this whole field. The abstract statistics of a population study, at the individual level, are just people. Someone's actual great-great-great-grandparent, still present, still countable, hundreds of years later. And the DNA can even tell you roughly how far back that ancestor sat, from a single clue: the length of the segment. Every generation, recombination chops the inherited chunks a little shorter. So a long, unbroken stretch of one ancestry is the signature of a recent ancestor, a few generations back, before the shuffle had time to cut it up. A short, isolated fragment is the fingerprint of a distant one, sliced down across many generations to the sliver that survived. Which means ancestry isn't only a set of percentages. Read carefully, it's a timeline. The bands on the ribbon are a rough clock, and geneticists can use them to estimate not just where a person's ancestors came from, but roughly when their lines converged. For African Americans, that clock points, again and again, back toward the same centuries. The genome keeps the date of its own making. And there's a reason geneticists went to the trouble of building all of this in the first place. It isn't idle curiosity. The same fact that makes African American ancestry so individual, that it varies segment by segment along the chromosome, turns out to be a powerful tool for medicine. It's called admixture mapping, and the logic is quietly clever. If a particular disease is more common in people whose ancestry traces to one region, then somewhere in the genome, near the gene that actually matters, you would expect that ancestry to show up a little more often in the people who have the disease. So researchers scan the painted ribbons, looking for a stretch where one ancestry is unexpectedly enriched among the affected, and that stretch tells them where to hunt for the gene. Because African American genomes carry segments from more than one source, woven together, they are especially informative for this kind of search. Work using exactly this approach has helped locate genetic factors in conditions from hypertension to kidney disease. And it's worth being precise about what that does and does not mean. It does not mean one ancestry is healthier or stronger or better than another. That framing is exactly backwards. It means the mixture itself, the very thing that makes each person's ancestry unique, is scientifically valuable. The individuality isn't noise to be averaged away, it's signal. The same spread that refuses to collapse into a single number is part of what lets these genomes help everyone. And that brings us to the deepest gap the study exposes, the gap between how America sorted people and what the genome actually says. For much of American history, a single rule governed racial classification: the one-drop rule. One African ancestor, however far back, and a person was legally and socially classified as black, with everything that classification was built to deny them. Set that rule beside Bryc's spread of numbers, and the two do not describe the same world. The one-drop rule treats ancestry as a switch, on or off, pure or not. The genome shows a spectrum running the entire length of the scale, from nearly all one ancestry to nearly all another, with every possible mixture in between. The rule sorted people into two boxes. The DNA doesn't have boxes. It has a continuous, individual range, a different hand for almost every person. Which tells you something important about what race, in that legal sense, ever was. It was not a reading of the genome. The genome was never consulted. It was a rule imposed on top of people, a system for deciding who got what. And the sex-biased ancestry we saw earlier is the genetic record of exactly who held the power to impose it. The category was real in its consequences. It was never real in the blood. So let's pull all the way back. A study set out to find the number for African American ancestry. What it found instead was that no single number exists, and that the absence of one is the honest answer, not a failure to reach one. On average, a little over 3/4 West African. But underneath that average, 365 people, no two holding the same hand. From nearly all West African ancestry to only a trace. European ancestry entering down the male line and African down the female. A faint, uneven thread of Native American ancestry, all of it shifting from one region of the country to the next. And even the African share itself, a blend of many distinct peoples. A whole population's history, written not as one story, but as hundreds of individual ones. Remember the deck. Ancestry is dealt, not blended. Reshuffled every generation, a fresh hand each time. That is why the numbers scatter. That is why there is no single genome. And that is why the truest thing you can say about African American ancestry is not a percentage at all. Because a percentage was always the wrong unit. Ancestry isn't a grade or a rank or a measure of how much of something a person is. It's a record of where a family has been, and what was done, and who survived it, and who they became on the other side. It's lineage and history, not essence, and never a score. The DNA doesn't tell you what someone is, it tells you where they come from. And for African Americans, where they come from is not one place and not one number. It's a braid of continents pulled together by one of the hardest histories a people ever carried, and carried through. If this changed the way you think about what an ancestry percentage actually means, subscribe, because we read the real studies, name the real scientists, and follow the DNA wherever it honestly leads. There's always more in the genome than a single number could ever hold.